The silence in Starbound 6 was stifling, each crew member weighed down by the realization that their teammate was gone without a trace. Ethan's disappearance left a haunting emptiness in their ranks, an absence that felt wrong, unnatural. But it was the way he had vanished, the eerie, distorted echo of his voice, the strange mist that seemed to swallow him whole, that filled them with a dread they couldn't shake. Captain Ellis stared at her screen, her jaw clenched as she reviewed their recordings, looking for any clue that might explain what had happened. She had known the dangers of uncharted territory, had anticipated the possibility of loss. But this was beyond any nightmare she could have imagined. The whispers of her father's last mission nagged at the edge of her mind, but she forced herself to focus. They had to keep moving, had to understand the forces at play on Selene 9 if they were to have any chance of surviving. "We need to continue the investigation," she said finally, her voice resolute though her heart felt anything but steady. "Ethan's gone, but maybe we can find out what happened to him and prevent it from happening again." Yasmin looked up from her equipment, her eyes shadowed with fear, but her resolve unbroken. She nodded, beginning diagnostics on the malfunctioning environmental sensors. Calder, too, seemed shaken, his hands trembling slightly as he gathered his instruments. He was unnervingly quiet, his mind clearly churning with a mix of fear and scientific curiosity that he struggled to keep in balance. The crew stepped outside the ship once again, their footsteps heavier with apprehension as they ventured back into the mist-covered landscape. The faint pulse that had haunted them earlier seemed to linger in the background, almost like a distant memory, barely perceptible yet somehow always present. Ellis led them down the path they had previously taken, her flashlight beam cutting through the mist to reveal the towering, jagged formations that loomed ahead. The strange, spire-like structures looked even more unnatural now, their twisted forms appearing almost like the fossilized remains of something ancient and once living. She couldn't shake the feeling that these were not just random geological anomalies. They looked arranged, purposeful, like sentries marking the boundaries of a forbidden place. Dr. Calder knelt beside one of the formations, his gloved fingers tracing the faint markings etched into the stone. The symbols were unfamiliar, yet oddly organic, spiraling in shapes that seemed to pulse and breathe under his touch. He muttered to himself, lost in his thoughts, before glancing up at Captain Ellis. "These carvings," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "they're not just marks. They're structured, a pattern, a language, maybe even a warning. Or a map," Yasmin added, her voice tense as she scanned the surroundings. "Maybe these structures are leading us somewhere." They continued along the strange path, moving deeper into the heart of the formations. The air grew thicker, humid with a strange warmth that defied the moon's recorded lack of atmosphere. The mist clung to them, denser now, pressing down as though trying to force them back, to prevent them from going any further. At last they came upon an opening, a wide, hollowed-out chasm that stretched downward into darkness. It was immense, far larger than they had anticipated, its walls lined with the same strange symbols they had seen above. Calder aimed his flashlight down, revealing layers of twisted shapes embedded into the walls of the chasm. The shapes grew more distinct the deeper they went, revealing outlines of skeletal remains, distorted and warped. What is this place?" Yasmin whispered, her voice thick with dread. Calder's flashlight traced the shapes on the walls, his gaze narrowing as he began to discern their features. The bones were unmistakable, though they were unlike any he had studied before, elongated, with joints in places that defied earthly biology. Some appeared almost human, while others were twisted into grotesque configurations, their limbs interlocked with one another in an intricate web of remains. Many of the skulls bore signs of trauma, deep fractures and dents, as if they had suffered unspeakable violence. "These aren't just fossils," Calder murmured, his voice trembling. "These remains were arranged, almost as if, like offerings," Ellis interrupted, her own voice laden with revulsion and fear. "Or trophies." It was then that she noticed a glint further down the wall, a spot of metallic sheen that seemed out of place among the ancient remains. She approached, squinting as her flashlight illuminated the object, a torn, battered spacesuit, embedded partially in the rock, its visor shattered. The name tag on the suit was barely legible, but she could just make out the letters, ELLIS. Her heart pounded as recognition set in. It was her father's suit, the very one he had worn on his ill-fated mission so many years ago. A chill crept up her spine as she took a step back, her mind racing to piece together what this meant. Her father's mission had reached Selene 9, but instead of finding Discovery, it had found this. A graveyard, a tomb for those who dared trespass. "Captain, look over here," Yasmin's voice broke through Ellis's daze. She turned to see Yasmin pointing further into the cavern. The path opened into a massive underground chamber, its floor littered with more remains, arranged in spirals that radiated outward. In the center of the chamber, illuminated by faint, pulsing lights from the walls, stood what looked like an altar made of twisted bone and rock, woven together with an eerie, organic precision. The crew approached slowly, and as they did, an unmistakable stench filled the air, a pungent odor of decay that clung to the back of their throats. Upon closer inspection, they could see fleshy growths sprouting from the altar, sinewy, pulsing tissue that appeared disturbingly alive, as though it were feeding off the remains surrounding it. Calder's voice was tight with a mixture of horror and fascination. "This is biological, some kind of parasitic growth. I think it's using these bodies, recycling them." "Recycling?" Yasmin asked, horrified. "It's taking in the dead, breaking them down, and repurposing them to sustain itself." He hesitated, his voice shaking. "Whatever this is, it's not just surviving. It's thriving. And it's feeding on whatever it can find." Ellis swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. "Then this moon, it's not a rock, it's a host. It's some kind of ecosystem, feeding off anything that lands here. It consumed my father's crew. And now..." Her words trailed off as a soft, wet sound broke the silence, a slithering, sliding noise from the far side of the chamber. All flashlights turned toward the source, illuminating a figure emerging from the shadows. It was human-shaped, but grotesquely altered. The figure wore a spacesuit, but it was fused to its body. The helmet's visor cracked, revealing an inhuman face beneath, its eyes wide and empty, skin stretched tight over twisted bone. It took them a moment to recognize him, but the hollow, guttural moan that escaped its throat left no doubt. "Ethan," Calder whispered, his face draining of color. The creature stumbled forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its skin was laced with tendrils of the same organic growths they had seen on the altar, which pulsed with a sickly, rhythmic beat, seemingly in sync with the heartbeat that still resonated from the walls. The creature that had once been Ethan reached out, its fingers elongated and fused together, tips curled into sharp, claw-like points. Captain Ellis raised her weapon, her hands shaking as she aimed it at the figure before her. She hesitated, the weight of what she was about to do pressing down on her. But the thing that had been Ethan took another step forward, its mouth opening to emit a low, rasping moan that seemed to echo through the chamber. "It's not him anymore, Mora," Yasmin whispered, her voice thick with tears. "You have to let him go." Ellis took a deep, shuddering breath, then pulled the trigger. The blast struck Ethan's mutated form, sending him stumbling back. But it didn't fall. Instead, the creature's body shuddered, and a thick, dark fluid oozed from the wound, its tendrils twitching and writhing as if alive, desperately clinging to the flesh that held them. Realization dawned on Calder as he watched the writhing growths. It's the organism. It's fused itself with his body. It's trying to regenerate, to survive even after death. Ellis fired again, each shot filling her with a wrenching sense of loss, until finally the creature collapsed to the floor, its tendrils curling inward as they died. The silence that followed was heavy, oppressive, filled with the weight of what they had witnessed. But even as Ethan's body lay still, the pulsing heartbeat continued, stronger and more insistent, as though enraged by their defiance. The walls around them seemed to close in, the organic tissue seething with energy, the mist thickening and pressing down on them with a palpable malevolence. "We need to leave," Ellis said, her voice a harsh whisper. "Now!" Without another word, the crew turned, retreating through the mist-choked passage. Their footsteps hurried, driven by the growing certainty that something far more sinister was lurking just beyond their sight. The moon was alive, and it was angry, and it was not about to let them leave. The journey back to the Starbound 6 felt like an eternity. Every step dogged by the oppressive pulse that thrummed through the air and within their chests. The low, insistent rhythm was no longer just a background noise. It had become part of them, a visceral, nauseating beat that synchronized with their own heartbeats, twisting their sense of reality into something monstrous. Captain Ellis led Yasmin and Calder through the mist-laden pathways, her flashlight slicing through the darkness, yet even its beam seemed feeble against the weight of shadows closing in. They were running low on oxygen, their reserves drained by the extended search for Ethan and the endless malfunctions of their equipment. The hiss of their breathing felt louder than their footsteps, each inhale a painful reminder that time was slipping away. But worse than the dwindling oxygen was the sense of something following them, an invisible presence, lurking just at the edge of their vision, shifting with the mist. "Keep moving," Ellis whispered, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain composed. "Don't stop. Not for anything." The three of them trudged forward, their bodies aching from exhaustion and fear. Calder lagged behind, his gaze distant, distracted by a dull throbbing that seemed to pulse from within his own flesh. He lifted his arm, his sleeve rolling back to reveal his forearm, where faint, sickly green veins spread beneath his skin like spider webs. The sight filled him with a nameless dread, an instinctive horror that clawed at his mind, but he said nothing, forcing himself to keep up. The ship came into view, a faint silhouette against the mist, a beacon of safety, the last semblance of sanctuary in this alien hell. But even as they reached the ramp, Ellis felt the hairs on her neck rise, the primal instinct of being hunted seizing her as she turned to face the darkness behind them. A figure loomed at the edge of the mist, its shape distorted, its body twisted in grotesque angles. More followed, each one shambling forward, their eyes wide and empty, their skin riddled with the same parasitic tendrils that had overtaken Ethan. She could make out faintly familiar faces, faces from the logs of her father's lost crew, now twisted, contorted with pain. Some had their helmets shattered, revealing hollow, hungry eyes that locked onto her with unnatural intensity. "Get inside," she shouted, shoving Calder and Yasmin up the ramp. The hatch slammed shut behind them as Ellis activated the locks, her fingers shaking. The moans of the creatures outside filled the silence, a chorus of agony and desperation that reverberated through the hull, pressing down on them with a maddening persistence. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the sounds, but they grew louder, scraping at the edges of her sanity. We have to leave. We have to get off this moon," Yasmin whispered, her voice trembling as she slumped against the wall, her face pale and eyes wide with terror. Calder nodded, but his expression was distant, his gaze unfocused. The veins on his forearm had spread further, crawling up to his elbow, and the skin around them was beginning to bulge, as if something beneath it was writhing, eager to break free. Ellis noticed and her heart sank. "Calder, what's happening to you?" He looked down at his arm, a flicker of panic crossing his face as he pulled his sleeve over the veins. I don't know. I think I touched something back there, in the chamber. The growths, they're in me." Before she could respond, he doubled over, clutching his stomach, his face contorted in agony. His skin began to ripple, bulging unnaturally as something beneath the surface squirmed and writhed, pressing against his flesh. His breaths grew labored, punctuated by sharp gasps as he fell to his knees. "Help me," he whispered, his voice a broken plea, his eyes locking onto Ellis with a terror she'd never seen before. "Please, don't let it take me." But even as she reached out, his body convulsed, a low, guttural scream tearing from his throat as his skin split open, dark tendrils erupting from the wounds. They writhed and twisted, coiling around his limbs, fusing with his flesh as his body contorted, transforming into something grotesque, something alien. Yasmin screamed, scrambling backward, her eyes wide with horror as she watched her friend's transformation. Ellis felt a swell of nausea, a wave of helplessness that threatened to pull her under, but she couldn't let it consume her. Not now. With a final, agonized scream, Calder collapsed to the floor, his body twitching as the tendrils coiled around him, their pulsating movements growing weaker until they finally lay still. Ellis forced herself to breathe, her mind racing as she tried to process what had just happened, but she knew one thing for certain: they couldn't stay here. "Yasmin, get to the controls," she said, her voice barely steady. "We're launching, now." Yasmin nodded, still trembling, but managed to pull herself to her feet. She stumbled to the cockpit, her hands fumbling with the controls as she activated the launch sequence. Ellis took a last, haunted look at Calder's remains, a pang of guilt and sorrow piercing her heart. But she turned away, forcing herself to focus on survival, on escape. As the engines roared to life, the ship shuddered, the vibrations resonating through the hull. Ellis could feel the creatures outside, their desperate moans rising in pitch, growing frantic as they sensed their prey slipping away. They clawed at the exterior, their fingers scraping against the metal, their faces pressed against the viewport, hollow eyes filled with longing and rage. But as the Starbound 6 lifted off, breaking free of Selene 9's grip, Ellis felt a flicker of hope. They were leaving, escaping the nightmare that had claimed so many before them. The creatures' forms grew smaller, their moans fading as the ship climbed higher, pushing through the thin, hostile atmosphere. But as Yasmin guided the ship away, Ellis noticed a faint, pulsing glow on her hand, a tiny, sickly green vein snaking across her palm. Her stomach twisted with dread as she pulled her sleeve back, revealing more veins creeping up her arm, spreading slowly, insidiously. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with horror. Yasmin glanced over, her face draining of color as she realized what was happening. No, Mora. We're leaving. We're safe. We have to be safe." But even as she spoke, the heartbeat returned, faint but persistent, a familiar rhythm that pulsed within them both, synchronizing with their own. It wasn't the moon that had been the threat, it was the life on it. And that life was now within them, nestled in their bodies, spreading with each heartbeat. Selene 9 had not just been a predator. It had been a contagion, a parasite that would hitch a ride to Earth, hidden within the survivors who had dared to set foot on its surface. Captain Ellis felt a cold calm settle over her. She knew what she had to do. She looked at Yasmin, the young engineer's face filled with denial and desperation, her hands shaking as she clung to the controls. "Yasmin," Ellis said softly, her voice firm but gentle. "We can't go back." Yasmin's eyes widened, her breath catching as she realized what Ellis meant. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No. There has to be another way. We can't. Mora, we can't." But Ellis reached over, placing her hand on Yasmin's trembling fingers, and looked into her eyes with a final, sorrowful determination. "If we go back, we'll bring this thing with us. We'll doom everyone." Yasmin's sobs filled the cockpit as she nodded, broken and defeated, as the weight of their fate settled upon her. She watched as Ellis entered the override sequence, her hands steady as she set the ship on a direct course toward Hesperia's gas clouds, a descent that would crush the ship, incinerating them and the alien life they carried before it could reach another world. As the ship turned toward the vast, swirling expanse of Hesperia's atmosphere, Ellis felt an odd peace. The heartbeat still throbbed in her veins, insidious and hungry, but she knew it would end here, with them. The ship accelerated, the roar of the engines filling the silence as they plunged into the gas giant's thick clouds, its crushing pressure tearing at the hull. Yasmin's hand found hers, their fingers entwining in a silent farewell, their breaths steady as they braced for the end. In those final moments, as the ship buckled and the alien presence writhed within them, Captain Mora Ellis closed her eyes, letting herself feel the weight of her father's legacy, the love and loss that had brought her here. She had come to Selene 9 for answers, for closure, but instead she had found something dark, something beyond comprehension. Yet here, at the edge of life and death, she knew she had made her choice to protect those who would come after, to end the horror here and now. With a final deafening crash, the Starbound 6 was swallowed by the atmosphere, its metal shell collapsing, its remains disintegrating, vanishing into the storm. And far above, Selene 9 drifted silently in Hesperia's orbit, its mist curling in contentment, waiting patiently for the next unwary visitors, the next brave soul seeking answers. it would consume whole, leaving only bones and memories as its dark legacy continued.